All right, let's jump right into this explainer by traveling back in time a bit, specifically to the year 1910. Picture this. You're deep in the rainforest belt of West Africa, in present-day Nigeria, and you unearth this breathtaking, incredibly lifelike bronze portrait head right out of the soil. Now, a discovery like that absolutely should have rewritten the history books on the spot. But instead, it ended up sparking one of the most absurd historical myths of the entire 20th century. So today, we're going to explore the sacred city of Ile-Ife. It was this bustling, ancient metropolis with mind-blowing technological brilliance that was totally suppressed by colonial prejudice at the time. But as you'll see, its legacy was so powerful, it ultimately crossed oceans to shape cultures all over the globe.
Evidence of the lost civilization of Atlantis. I mean, seriously, that was the actual, astonishing conclusion drawn by German explorer Leo Frobenius when he first laid eyes on the magnificent Olokun head in Ile-Ife. Frobenius was, very much a man of his time and heavily influenced by a deeply racist worldview. So when he's suddenly confronted with this incredibly composed, highly self-assured portrait cast in copper alloy, his prejudice literally prevented him from believing that African artists were capable of creating such a masterpiece. Instead of just acknowledging the sheer brilliance of the Yoruba people, he convinced himself he had somehow stumbled upon the mythical lost city of Atlantis.
But modern archaeology completely shatters that old European assumption of superiority. Back then, a lot of ethnographic museums were built entirely on this false narrative that colonized peoples were, primitive, and that they relied exclusively on imported goods and foreign influence. But the reality on the ground was vastly different. When archaeologists excavated Ile-Ife, they revealed a highly advanced industrial African metropolis. And we aren't just talking about a couple of lucky artisans here. We're talking about incredibly sophisticated lost wax bronze casting and massive, large-scale industrial glass monopolies.
Which brings us to engineering an African metropolis. To truly grasp the scale of Ile-Ife, we literally need to look at the ground beneath their feet. But before we map out the city's rapid growth, we really have to recognize the sheer technical dexterity of its people. Artisans there used the lost wax process, which is a highly complex metallurgical technique, to cast these super realistic portrait heads from copper alloy. And these weren't crude, basic representations. They depicted composed, self-assured individuals looking out at the world with total confidence. The level of perfection they achieved here easily rivals the naturalism you'd see in ancient Greece or Rome.
And looking at how this evolved, it was a rapid jump from scattered homesteads into sub-Saharan Africa's first centralized metropolis. Around 300 AD, there was a major dry period that pushed the Yoruba people to expand into the water-rich valleys of Ile-Ife. Fast forward to 700 AD, and they've developed this concept of divine kingship. By the 10th century, urbanization is rapidly accelerating, pulling all these different lineages together to live side by side. And then, by the 13th and 14th centuries, Ile-Ife enters its golden age. It's a bustling, centralized city-state operating at the absolute height of its prosperity. And a huge part of that golden age was the city's infrastructure. According to oral tradition, street paving was actually initiated by Luwo, who was the only female king of Ile-Ife. The story goes she didn't want to step in the mud during the rainy season, and she wanted her city to be easily accessible to visitors. So she had almost every street and alley paved. And the engineering was genius. They pushed interlocking terracotta shards and stones straight into the earth to create these incredibly solid floors. What's really fascinating is that all those countless ceramic shards, they were actually recycled pottery brought in from the provinces. So they were literally materializing the vast reach of the empire right there into the streets of the capital.
So the crucial takeaway here is that Ile-Ife wasn't just importing luxury goods. They were manufacturing them. For the longest time, experts assumed sub-Saharan Africa only remelted imported glass. But the industrial ruins of a district called Igbo Olokun totally prove otherwise. They show that Ile-Ife held a strict monopoly on the primary production of these highly coveted dichroic and cobalt blue glass beads. They were absolute masters of pyrotechnology, operating on such a massive scale that they effectively polluted their own medieval city with the chemicals from their booming glass and copper industries.
Moving on to the rise of the divine kings, let's look at the political structure and see how this builds into an empire that declared itself the very center of the universe.
As the city centralized, conflict naturally popped up between the old guard and the new arrivals. Yoruba mythology frames this early urbanization beautifully as an epic rivalry between two deities. On one side, you have Obatala, representing the traditional hunter-gatherer rulers, and on the other side is Oduduwa, this dynamic newcomer. Oduduwa ultimately prevailed, taking control of Ile-Ife and replacing the individual family ancestral cults to become the highest religious and political authority, essentially the creator deity.
Under Oduduwa's lineage, Ile-Ife developed a really sophisticated idea of governance, centered around the Oni, or divine king. This was a ruler so sacred that their face was actually shielded by a curtain of vibrant glass beads to protect ordinary people from their gaze.
But here's the surprising part. This was not an absolute dictatorship. It was actually a system of indirect democracy. The Oni was chosen by representatives of the city's most important family lineages, who operated a lot like specialized guilds. So the people, through their representatives, essentially made the king.
But as with all great powers, the empire fragments. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Golden Age began to dim. A crisis of both politics and scientific knowledge caused the empire to fracture into competing satellite states like Benin and Oyo. 160. That is a massive number. It represents the kilometers of vertical V-shaped earthworks and deep ditches built by a splinter kingdom called Ijebu. As Ile-Ife's power started to wane, the glue holding the empire together dried up, and satellite states started fighting to fill that power vacuum. There was also a revolution in warfare happening, specifically the introduction of cavalry on horseback. So these massive 160-kilometer defensive trenches, some of which were 7 meters high and 10 meters wide, were explicitly engineered to stop horses dead in their tracks.
Right as the region was fragmenting politically, the 15th century brought Portuguese ships to the Bight of Benin. And this arrival completely rewired global trade. It shifted the economic center of gravity away from the inland Sahara networks and the Niger River and moved it directly to the coast. Ultimately, with the colonization of the Americas, the demand for slave labor just exploded, leading to the violent and deeply tragic displacement of multitudes of Yoruba men and women from their homeland.
Which leads us to a lasting global legacy. Because that brutal displacement inadvertently seeded one of the most profound, resilient, and far-reaching cultural expansions in human history.
The enslaved European people carried their beliefs across the ocean in their minds and hearts. They created a universalizing religious system that powerfully adapted to the New World. Think about it. Ancient deities originating all the way back in Ile-Ife, like Shango, Obatala, and Oduduwa, they aren't just confined to history books. They are actively worshipped today. They are profoundly influencing music, art, and spirituality in places like New Orleans, throughout Cuba, and across Brazil. The Yoruba cemented a truly global legacy that remains totally undiminished centuries later.
Finally, let's talk about returning the stolen treasures. Because despite this massive global influence, the physical heritage of Ile-Ife remains largely scattered, which has sparked some really intense modern debates over restitution. So remember Frobenius from 1910? Well, a British colonial officer actually intercepted him and returned the Olokun head back to the Oni of Ile-Ife at the time. But in the decades since, countless other bronze heads and treasures were unearthed, and many were removed during the colonial era. Now, they adorn prominent collections worldwide, like the British Museum. Returning these artifacts to Nigeria involves a really complex diplomatic journey and intense negotiation, but many argue it's absolutely essential, because having these artifacts home fundamentally reshapes how the entire world perceives African history.
Which brings us right back to the great mystery of our explainer. See, after the Olokun head was returned to the Oni in 1910, it seemingly just vanished. Later, in 1939, a British archaeologist examined a version of the head at a museum and claimed it was merely a replica. Now, the Lagos Museum maintains that they possess the authentic piece, so it really leaves us to wonder, where is the true original Olokun head? And more broadly, as we look around and see the undeniable, lasting global influence of Yoruba culture today, when will the entirety of their physical history finally be returned to its rightful home? It's a question that reminds us just how many hidden treasures and incredible stories are still out there, waiting to be uncovered beneath the soil.